Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. I will start by saying something about ways of knowing, because the whole connection to Jonas Salk, I think in Courtney's case and definitely in our case, comes from a certain notion of what it is to know. And of course, many people associate knowing with collecting facts. Some people associate knowing with collecting facts and reflecting on them. Some people associate it in a very straightforward manner with science, with a scientific method where you have a hypothesis, where you test the hypothesis, you discuss it. But in the end, whether you're having the sort of classic simpler ways of knowing or the formally arranged ways of knowing through the scientific method, whether you're dealing with poetry or the novel or film or music or painting, you are making what I like to call approximations to what is. So we do not have any ability to get to revelations of what things are beneath the surface, what individuals are beneath their surface and their behavior. What we can do is have approximations to what things are. And some approximations we do via the arts, via collecting facts and reflecting on them, and some we do by formal scientific method, which of course used to be very simple and now it's very complicated. When you come to the level of understanding how the brain works, which is what obviously interests us the most, we have extremely complex methods that require incredible amounts of machinery that has been designed for the purpose and requires incredible amounts of collaboration, because it is not possible any longer for a scientist to be the lone scientist that we have come to admire over the history of science, somebody who sits in an office with a desk, thinks, and comes up with great discoveries. The reason being that most of the great discoveries that could be achieved that way have actually been made, which is good, and they have been explored and validated through other methods, and now almost everything that needs to be discovered requires, certainly through the scientific method, a very, very complicated machinery. Which does not mean that the lone scientist thinker does not have a role to play in society and in knowing, and I think he and she does, because there's quite a lot that can be achieved by putting together ideas and reflecting on them and judging their validity and deciding whether or not they fit or there's something terribly wrong with them. And this can be done by lone individuals. It is not necessary to have a very complex MR scanner in order to reflect intelligently on the world. So there's this very complex picture that we're dealing with in terms of the world of knowing. So the fundamental methods that we use are methods that come from psychology. And psychology sort of became speciated in one particular kind that is very relevant to us, and that's neuropsychology. And neuropsychology evolved, especially in the 70s and beyond, by having numbers of tasks that aim at certain processes that are already pretty hooked into a neural structure, and one has a sense of which systems and parts of the brain are related, for example, to things like memory or attention or language and so forth. So we have a number of true and tried tasks that have measurable standards and that allow you to make evaluations both of normal individuals as well as of individuals with brain damage, with brain disease, that can be studied in all of their normal living conditions. Then in terms of the modern ways of studying the brain, clearly, of course, we have all the classical things available, and electroencephalography can be extremely sophisticated today and give you information that it was not giving you in in days past. But the fundamental tools are that of structural magnetic resonance imaging and functional magnetic resonance imaging. And basically what this does is, in one case, look at the structure and literally penetrate the structure of the brain all the way down to fiber systems and give you neuroanatomy, but give you a neuroanatomy that can be related to function either through lesion probes or through a variety of functional probes. And then you have functional imaging, in which you use proxies such as cerebral blood flow to measure what amount of blood flow is going on in a particular part of the brain, in a particular system, and that gives you the idea, gives you the dynamic aspects. And it's very interesting because basically the monster, the scanners are not evolving that fast, and they probably have evolved to about the most that they can do in terms of the basic raw technical capability. But what is evolving very much is the ways of analysis, or in the kinds of data that can be captured from the scanning and can really allow you enormously interesting manipulations in terms of studying how a part of the brain connects to another, what is the direction of the connectivity, what are the distributions of the fiber systems. And when you enrich that with the lesion method, in other words, when rather than studying normal individuals as we are here, we study somebody that has had, for example, a stroke and has an area of damage that is circumscribed and well-defined, you can then study the consequences of that area of damage, which really functions like a natural experiment. It was not done by an experimenter, but it's there as if it had been. And so you can study the consequences. What happens if there's damage here? What will it do in other parts of the brain? What will it do in the systems that it is naturally connected to? And what if it does things in systems that are elsewhere in the brain? All of that can now be inquired and can be studied, which is, of course, an extremely powerful way of getting into the understanding of these systems. And of course, all of this, there's one part of the entire group, which is known as the Dornsife Neuroscience Pavilion, that is directly with the Imaging Center, which Hannah directs, and where she has very active collaborations with a part of USC, which is the Viterbi School of Engineering, where you have all of these ace engineers that are developing pulse sequences and developing new modes of analysis in collaboration with her. There are two tools that are very important. One is known as BrainVox, which actually Hannah developed in the 1990s and gives you a way of creating a 3D volume of the brain. It's actually very beautiful. And then there's another one called Brain Suite, Suite S-U-I-T-E, not in the thing you put in your coffee, and that is being actively developed, and again, it can be applied to both normal brains and abnormal brains, but so much for tools that you can use that are the sort of the modern part of the scientific trade. And now I'm going to change over to another aspect of my talk, which is tell you what goes on in terms of the actual research programs. And I'm going to start with one that I consider sort of most emblematic of the Institute, and this is a large program on brain development. This ought to be interesting for you in this room, because what you're dealing with is with intermediate consequences of brain development when you are in a school such as Ross. So you're dealing with brains of individuals that are not quite mature, but that are considerably mature, of course. They're not children anymore. What we want to study is how those brains have been put together under influences that go all the way from the genome to the environment in which those brains of those individuals have appeared before and after birth. And there are two big arms to this program on brain development. And one is something that started several years ago. In fact, it started around the year 2000. And it came from an observation. If there is damage that can occur, for example, perinatally, can occur, for example, in some child that is premature, and you have damage that very often is very small, and in days in which there was not enough recognition of these conditions, and certainly not scanners available for routine study, the damage could fall into certain parts of the brain and have consequences later on. Now, it turns out that if you have damage, for example, in the language area, and if the damage occurs very early, there is an almost complete compensation of that kind of damage, to the best of our knowledge, and this might not be 100% true. But if the damage occurs in systems like the system of the frontal lobe, especially in certain parts of the frontal lobe that are more medial, what happens is that the damage is there, but it has consequences that will be felt as the child grows up and becomes an adolescent. And one of the worst effects that it can have is a disturbance to the emotional system that does not allow the child to process, for example, guilt the same way that normal children do, and does not allow the child to recognize that something wrong has happened, and there's a tremendous amount of censure going around that person. And so this is a very serious problem, and there could be other problems of this kind. And this is one of the things that we're studying in great detail by studying large numbers of children that have damage that can even occur in utero, so prior to the child being born, or occur shortly thereafter, and that can have these consequences, and that can be very different depending on what part of the brain gets affected. And right now, one of the things the people that are dealing mostly with this group of studies, besides Hannah, is a young neuroscientist by the name of Jessica Wisnowski. And Jessica is actually studying the chemical signature of some of these lesions in these very young brains. And this is something that is being done together with Children's Hospital of Los Angeles, CHLA, which is part of the USC hospital system and is one of the leading hospitals for children in the nation. And it's, these are studies that we have great hopes for. It would be, for example, important to recognize these effects early, decide quite early which ones are going, for example, which locations of lesion are going to produce a nasty consequence. If and when that is decided, find out ways in which you can reduce the negative impact of those lesions, so you can see the impact that this can have. It's going to take, of course, time to put all this picture together, but it's something that is well on its way, and we're now beginning to have a pretty good, solid experience, and the collaboration is excellent, and we're very hopeful for the results that we will get here. Then on brain development as well, but side by side with this aspect that has to do with brain pathology, with something that really went wrong and probably goes wrong, especially in prematurity and in some cases of twinning. We have one that has to do with people that are, to the best of our knowledge, entirely normal from the get-go. And this has to do, guess what, with music. And it is something that is totally vital to the mission of the Institute and gives it full use. And what it is a study of how children that are subject to a very intense musical training, beginning as early as age 6. How that intense musical training will change the organization of their brains, presumably for the better, but we don't know. That's why we have to find out. I don't think I have many doubts, but I should, and that's why we're going to do the right test. In Venezuela, this Dr. Abreu, who is, of course, a musician, created this form of education called El Sistema. And basically what he wanted was to go to the very poor neighborhoods in Venezuela where children were obviously being co-opted into a life of crime, to bring them into music training and into orchestras and musical groups. And this has been an absolutely amazing success. And there's a poster boy for this success, and that's Gustavo Dudamel, the chief music director of the Los Angeles Philharmonic, who is now acknowledged at age 30 as one of the leading conductors of the day. And he has been fully anointed by Pierre Boulez and by Claudio Abbado and by Daniel Barenboim, and he is really quite brilliant. In fact, he can conduct. We have seen him conduct everything from Mozart's Da Ponte operas to extensive Mahler symphonies, and he conducts the entire thing without a score. He doesn't even have a score. The other day we were at a rehearsal with him and with Yo-Yo Ma for the Dvorak cello concerto, and he was only about 2/3 of the way into the rehearsal, which was going without a hitch, that he suddenly stopped and he went at fast, furious speed to the point where they were, and he consulted it, and then he had a little conversation with Yo-Yo, and we continued on. So it's really quite remarkable, and this is one person that comes from an absolutely broken home, terrible conditions, and is this absolutely brilliant, successful young man. So to make a long story short, we have this mutual agreement between the Brain Creativity Institute and the Los Angeles Philharmonic, which created, because of Dudamel, created a thing called the Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles, and where all of these children are being recruited, not all from the most terrible neighborhoods, but you know that we have neighborhoods that can compete with Venezuelan neighborhoods, so we definitely are going to have children from these different backgrounds, and the idea is to study what will happen with these children. And we're going to have, of course, psychological measures, but also all of these non-invasive scanning measures, and we have wonderful cooperation from the group, and in fact the study is studied, everything is signed, and the studies are beginning September 1st on this large-scale group. So we have great hopes for this because we're totally convinced that this is an enormous influence on human behavior, and that you can produce great responses, and it certainly has been shown that that's the case. Because we do believe in control groups, there's going to be actually a control group, just in case. This is very, very tricky. We're going to compare the highly cooperative ensemble playing of these kids with competition, which never emphasizes competition except in the individual ability to play the instrument, with a competitive sport. And who knows what will... There's some people at the orchestra that say, oh my God, what if it turns out that the footballers are actually better than the musicians? Well, so be it. It will be what it will be, you know. But in the meantime, we're also doing other fun things, such as studying formally how, for example, musicians, Hannah has been doing a study of musical prodigies. So she literally has collected the brains all these smart musicians like Yo-Yo Ma and Daniel Barenboim and Midori and all of these people. She has the brains of all these people in a vat. The vat is, of course, in informatic mode, but they're there and they can appear in 3D, and some of them have very beautiful brains, very sexy brains. And we're studying, we're doing a lot of individual studies as well that can have an intriguing payoff. For example, there is a remarkable blind singer, a mezzo-soprano by the name of Rubin, who has actually had some great successes in New York and in LA, and she's blind from birth. There is no question is that she activates visual cortices quite systematically during auditory processing. So there's no question that those cortices are not being used for vision, but they are being activated by music processing in ways that actually have to do with another set of studies that is going on in our lab, which has to do, and this is relevant for the issue of imagination, with how you bring together information in the brain. Right now you're looking at me and you're hearing me. You definitely have both your visual impressions of me at the podium and the auditory impressions of my voice. They're fully integrated. If they were not fully integrated, the effect would be the kind of effect that in old movies when the projection system and the sound went separated and the lips were not in sync with the voice. And of course that doesn't happen. So you have a way of fully integrating this. And if you don't know much about neurophysiology, and if you don't know much about neuroanatomy, what you would imagine is that these things are landing in the same place, and that you have some kind of pool where auditory and visual information are being integrated, there and then. Well, it turns out that that's not the case, and that in fact, the brain honors a complete distinction between the points of the structure where the voice processing is landing and the visual processing is landing. It's almost like different cities. They're literally in brain distance terms, miles away. Here you have vision, here you have audition going on. And not only that, there are no direct connections from one to the other. So there's no way of having visual fibers talk directly to the auditory fibers and create a cross integration. So it turns out that the integration is actually made via an extremely complicated system of connections that first diverge from the arrival point of the sensory input and then concentrate in another point, or points, in fact it's not only one, and there is then feedback that goes to the origins of those connections. So this is an extremely complex system and one that is in a way counterintuitive because you would expect all this integration to be produced by a machine that would bring it all together, and that's not the way nature designed the machine. So it's very important to understand how this process is going. And so we have a series of very beautiful experiments that were led by Caspar Meyer. We have done experiments with three modalities: vision, with sound, and with touch. And we are revealing exactly where the hooks take place in the brain and how the kind of connectivity that you need. And also something very interesting, the kind of ambiguities that can be created. So for example, there's certain stimuli that are so ambiguous that the brain cannot really make the separation quite clearly when you cross from one modality to the other. Why is this important from the point of view of imagination and creativity? Is that you want to understand, when you think about the creative powers, the creative powers are really about the manipulation of images. And image in the broad sense of the term is not about visual images only, but about images of sound, images of touch, images that we have of our own body, and images that, of course, you can have in the olfactory system and in the taste system. But it is images in the sense that they are patterns. So the brain is giving you access to all of these perceptions of the world outside and of the world inside, thanks to the making of patterns in maps. And we're talking literally about maps. This is all cartography. You have the visual cortices or the auditory cortices or the somatosensory cortices are in fact extended maps with different stripes and regions, and they are mapping what is going on in a particular modality with a particular sub-modality as well. So for example, right now I'm looking at you and I'm seeing shapes, the shapes of your bodies, faces, heads, and so on, but I'm also seeing color. I am also seeing depth and the positions that you have in space. All of this is being mapped, and I insist on the word mapped, through a variety of stations of the nervous system, beginning at the retina. So at the retina level, we already have these maps being formed, except that in my retina right now, all of this is upside down, and I'm actually creating a map that is inverted of all of you. And then that map gets rectified and placed right side up, and is then conveyed through a variety of stations, at least 3 stations, up to the point in the visual cortex, where it is then distributed again to maps that operate on color, maps that operate on depth, maps that operate on movement, because you are, for example, doing this with your chin, and I'm picking up on that. And that requires a map that is in a specific area of the occipitoparietal region that is doing that. Of course, this happens also within the auditory system. So when we talk about creativity, we talk about the powers of imagination. And imagination is the manipulation of these images that, of course, occurs naturally, just bubbles up. It's part of our natural standard operating mode, but that then can be educated, and that can be educated by you. Of course, some people will be born with an amazing imaginative capacity, which means they're constantly creating images, breaking down things, combining and recombining in odd and interesting ways. But some people will not do that much, but you can incite them to do that by the way you play with them with drawing, the way you make them listen, the way you make them break what is appearing to them through the auditory or the visual route. But it's all about imagination, and then about directing that imagination for a certain purpose. That's what creativity is all about, is how you have a certain purpose that you want to achieve, and then you use your imagination to try to get to a way of constructing a particular result that you have in mind. Sometimes a result that you hardly see in your mind's eye, but still it is there, or you see in your mind's ear if you are a composer and trying to create an auditory space. Take somebody like Picasso or like Mozart, to go to 2 people that are really extreme in the production, extreme in the abilities that they had, and that they showed from a very early age, and in the case of Picasso until a very late age as well, almost undiminished. Those people probably have something particular about their respective auditory and visual systems. The majority of people probably don't have that. What they have is an enormous amount of training, an enormous amount of ability to cope with the material, and then a lot of things that are very important for creativity, which have to do with the social situation in which you are, with the way your emotional system operates, the kind of need you have to produce something in a certain context. You have in our society this tendency to declare people geniuses. So you see in prodigies, you see a young person who has been subject to very good music training and who does very well, And you have the children and then the young adults are considered off the scale, prodigies and so on. Well, I don't think we can say that the prodigies are that prodigious or that rare because we have not subject people to the same kinds of education. I think one of the things that El Sistema is going to show, and other such, because now there's going to be a mushrooming of El Sistemas all over the place, is that lots of people can achieve that, provided there is the right social context, provided there is the motivation, and provided the training is effective. So back to the imagination. Here you have, those are the basic tools with which you write creativity. You have to have those tools, and they're all over the brain, social context, and the kind of emotional need, the kind of emotional operation that is there to motivate you to stay on track, stay on task, and achieve a certain result. And of course, it's very dangerous to try to reduce things like creativity to just one or two or three ingredients, because it's always much more complex than that. Obviously, you need to have a certain degree of native intelligence or developed intelligence in order to be able to do something that is of worth to other people. But the basic tokens are there, but you cannot fail to incorporate images and imagination in the process of whatever modality it is. And basically, these are the modalities that you have to deal with. You basically have 5 domains on which you can operate and the integrations of those domains. And of course, these days, things are actually much more complex and interesting because the domains have been much more mixed. In fact, ever since the development of cinema, which is an incredibly interesting art, you have this great combination of artistic forms. You have, of course, the inheritance from the novel and poetry. You have the inheritance from painting, and then you have the auditory inheritance that comes from music. Not even when people sometimes say, well, what about silent movies? Well, the silent movies were never silent, because whenever you went to a silent movie, I never did, but I read the descriptions, somebody was banging on a piano or an organ, so there was a soundtrack. And of course, these days, soundtracks are absolutely vital to the movies. It's actually quite astounding that people don't give more value to what goes on in the soundtrack, all the way from the way sound is being built into the film, and as well the score, which is absolutely critical, and I think people are very aware of that. So now you have all of these combines of artistic creativity. There's something very different biologically about music. When you think about the visual system, you have the retina, you have the geniculate nucleus. Don't worry about where it is. It's behind the eye. And then you have the visual cortex. So basically, in this most recent of all sensory channels, you go from the periphery, the retina, to the central nervous system in 2 stops. So imagine a TGV with only 1 stop before you get to the terminus, okay? Pretty good. If you go into the auditory system, first of all, you don't start here, you start here in the ear, and you then have to go across 6 stations before you get to the auditory cortex. What this is telling you very blatantly is that these 2 senses evolved very differently at very different points in evolution and based on very different sources of input. And in one case, you have to go ploddingly over all these steps and change the signal and create new adaptations and new computations. And in the other, you go literally fast speed from one place to the terminus. Not only that, in the case of vision, you literally bypass all the structures of the brain that have to do with life regulation and emotion. In fact, all the emotions that we draw from looking at a beautiful room or building or person or painting, we draw them by secondary effect from the visual image on the emotive systems. The emotions we draw from music are coming directly from the sound processing at the level of life regulatory systems, because the whole thing lands in the brainstem, okay? And whereas one is a telesense, and you're relying on photons hitting the retina, in the other, you're relying on something as primitive as one thing hitting another, which is what happens when sound waves hit the tympanic membrane and then are communicated through three little ossicles back into the window where you have the cochlea and where you get the first transformation from sound to electrical impulses. So it's a very different, in other words, think of it this way, the engineers were different. And different engineers were put on the auditory problem and on the visual problem. And of course, if you go through the problem of how we sense our internal organs, it's still another problem and another engineer and another age that, lo and behold, came before the hearing age. So you really have these successions of ages of evolution of the senses, and it would stand to reason that our imaginative powers, as they are based on these different processes, are going to be very different as well. They have a different take on reality. You know, I'm looking at your face, and I get a very full description of your face, complete with the glasses and your shirt and so on. It's an incredibly detailed representation of you as a body, okay? When I hear music, or when I hear somebody, something a knock outside the door of this office, or when you hear this, you don't see this desk and you don't see the pen. What you hear is something that was produced by the interaction of the pen with the wood in the desk. So you're dealing with a secondary effect that was produced on this object. So this is just to call attention to the fact that these are very different things, and the brain is going to handle them differently, and there is this incredible closeness of the auditory process to the regulatory organs. Here the great beauty is that the place where the cochlear nucleus is located in the brainstem is just about the same level as the nuclei that are running, for example, our circulatory system, our lungs, our digestive systems, our metabolism, all the regulation that is vital for life, and the basic emotional systems. For example, the regulation of pain, the regulation of pleasure, it's all there. So my poetic take on this, and I have written a little bit about this, and one of these days I'll write more, is that music has direct line into the emotions and into life regulation. And I'm very convinced that this is the reason why music is so universal and is so widespread. It doesn't make any difference whether if you have Mozart or Beethoven, you could be in China, you could be here, you could be in the moon, and it works. And provided you have human beings that have the basic conception that we have, and we do, so I think you're going to have that effect. What affects people visually is slightly different. And this, of course, is independent of all schools and styles and so on, which is another layer, another story. But there's something here. You cannot take visual arts and sound arts and say, well, they're on the same level. They're not. They're very different. I mean, they can be on the same level in our estimation. Of course, there's no reason why you should like painting more than music or vice versa. But they are different quantities. They're different stuff, okay? We are very interested in understanding the phenomena of feeling. Feeling in the broad sense of the term. So feelings that go all the way from feelings of pain to feelings of pleasure to feelings of the emotions. Since around 1990, we have done a variety of studies on fundamental emotions, all the way from the basic emotions like fear, joy, to complex social emotions like compassion and admiration and gratitude, which are, by the way, things that we are studying now, and we're even studying cross-culturally. So, for example, we have in our group, in one of our young faculty, Mary Helen Immordino-yang, she's doing a cross-cultural study of emotions, of the social emotion type in China, in the US, and in Asian Americans. But beyond the issue of emotion, which is really about action and about generating a pattern of behavior, the issue of how you feel the emotion, of how you feel a certain physical state is, I think, the crux of studies on consciousness, with all the different shades of what we can have when we take the complex phenomenon of consciousness. And one of the things that we're quite interested in is, number one, at systems level, the fact that the sources of emotion, of emotional feelings, is not necessarily in the cerebral cortex alone, and this has been the traditional take, but actually, and rather, in the brain stem. So if you look at a central nervous system, you have, of course, the spinal cord, then you have this sector, which is the brain stem, that goes all the way up to the hypothalamus, not hippocampus, and then you have the big expanse of the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is, of course, the modern part of the brain, the one that makes us be human in the sense of our capabilities, of our instrumentalities, and is present in many other species, but it's certainly the most developed. When you look at the brain stem, it's been preserved for most of evolution, from fish up, with pretty much the same design. It's a little bit enriched, there are a few more elements, but fundamentally it is the same structure. And we have shown in our prior research that clearly cerebral cortex, especially a part of the cerebral cortex called the insular cortex, is vital as the platform to feel feelings, which is different from where you have the emotions. So if you go back 15 years, 20 years, people thought that there were emotional centers where you would provoke, say, laughter or crying, and you would feel the results of laughter or crying all in the same place. And this is completely wrong. And we were instrumental in showing that, in fact, these are separate systems, and that the system that allows you to feel is not the system that allows you to do the emotion that you can feel. These are different parts. And this has all the sorts of impact in our understanding of mental illness, in our understanding of things such as depression and pain and drug addiction. That's why it is so absolutely critical, besides, of course, the pleasure of understanding what on earth is going on in our brains. The interesting thing is that we have now shown, there's a paper that came out this year in cerebral cortex with me and Hannah and another colleague, Dan Fresnel, in which we showed that besides the insula, there's this old part of the brain stem that people have always poo-pooed as too primitive to be of any consequence, that is critical for our feelings of pain, of pleasure, and of emotions. And this is very important because it connects with an idea that is anathema for many people. People have wanted to preserve feelings for human beings, and they did not want animals to have feelings. And of course, since the animals have these structures in spades, it would be very convenient not to give them feelings. And this, of course, anybody that has seen animals react with joy or pain to different conditions knows that this is complete baloney, and that of course they have feelings, even if you cannot ask them to confess to us what feelings they have, but we have other ways of extrapolating that. So this is a very important point of contention, but I think that we're winning the battle quite correctly. And the final point, the thing that we are involved in right now, which is a quest for the neuron level of the feeling systems. So if you think about our cognition, if you think about the kind of intellectual dialogues that we can have and we will be having when we sit down for the next session. You think about work that is mental work, but is being carried out by large networks of neurons and depends critically on synapses, depends critically on the fact that one synapse is connected to the next neuron and there's an action that leads to the operation of the next neuron. So it stands to reason that when we feel, and by the way, feeling is a critical operation. I mean, just think about what you would be without feelings of pleasure, pain, emotions, whatever. You would be zombies of no great consequence. So we fortunately are not that. So it's very important to understand where does that come from. And where does that come from, in our view, is actually from the operation of a part of the neuron that is the axon, for reasons that are quite complicated to explain, but this is part of a set of new hypotheses that we are studying right now. So if you would ask me, what is the thing that most excites you at the moment in terms of research, besides all these other things that the Institute is doing and are very interesting, what excites me is the possibility of exploring at the level of axons what are the sets of operations that the axon does or does not do that serve as the undergirding for sentience, the undergirding for feeling sentience. So that's a very important point. And so I just would like to close with one comment, make a big distinction between basic homeodynamics and social homeodynamics. And this goes back to a conversation that Bill and I were having yesterday during the discussion, is that there's something quite odd about the fact that these regulations are happening in living creatures that don't even have brains. So if you go to unicellular organisms that don't have brains, those organisms have a homeodynamic process, or they would die immediately. Those organisms, furthermore, have something like a social behavior, as we were discussing, for example, in something like bacteria, and they don't have a brain. So there's something that is already inherent in that life that is going to be more explicit once brains develop, once nervous systems develop. And the important point, though, is that even if those organisms have homeostasis or homeodynamics and have this basic regulation and even some kind of sentience, one thing definitely do not have is what this talk and morning is about, which is creativity. For creativity, you need to have something much more complex, which is what I call social homeodynamics or social homeostasis. So it's something that requires a body of knowledge and consciousness in the full sense of the term, so that you actually have a sense of the others, and you have a sense of the objects, you have a sense of how things are put together, and then using those images that we talk about, we can manipulate all this stuff and try to identify a problem and try to solve that problem, whether that problem is the representation of someone in a painting or a piece of music or a building or a piece of science. Okay? So that's how I wanted to close. Thank you.